Hey everybody, this video is called Subjected Under Babylon, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Kings, looking at the 24th chapter, where we're going to be looking at Judah being subjected to under Babylon. So chapter 24, starting verse 1, opens up. In the days Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. So what's interesting in the book of 2 Kings here is many times we don't think about King Nebuchadnezzar until we get to the book of Daniel, when we look at the fiery furnace with the 3 Hebrew boys. But we see King Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible here as early as 2 Kings right here. And so Nebuchadnezzar II, he was the son of Nabopolassar, the king of Babylon, between 625 and 605 BC. And Nebuchadnezzar, he was the crown prince leading his father's army against Pharaoh Necho and the Egyptians at Carchemish on the Euphrates River in northern Syria. And by defeating the Egyptians, we see that Babylon has now become the established as the strongest nation in the ancient Near East world at this time. And Egypt and its vassals, including Judah, became vassals of Babylon with this victory. And Nebuchadnezzar, he followed up on his victory at Carchemish by invading the land of Judah. And later, in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, he took captives to Babylon, including, like I was mentioning in the opening here, Daniel and his friends, as seen in Daniel chapter 1. And toward the end of 605 BC, Nabopolassar, his father, died, leaving Nebuchadnezzar succeeding him as king of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar, he went on to be king from 605 to 562 BC. So if you remember from a previous study, I mentioned that the books of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings combined, they cover about 400 years of history. And Jeremiah 25:1, it says it was after 3 years after Jehoiakim had taken the throne in Judah. And Nebuchadnezzar, he took tribute from all the kings of the west, including Jehoiakim of Judah, and he returned to the west in 604 BC. And Jehoiakim, he submitted to Babylonian rule from 604 to 602 BC. And in 602 BC, Jehoiakim rebelled against Babylon. And we see that he disregarded the prophet Jeremiah's advice given in Jeremiah 27, verse 9 through 4. And verse 2 through 4 continues, and the Lord sent him against him, raiding bands of Chaldeans, bands of Syrians, bands of Moabites, and bands of the people of Ammon. He sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord which he had spoken by his servants the prophets. Surely the commandment of the Lord, this came upon Judah, to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also because of the innocent blood that he had shed, for he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. So verses 2 through 4, we see as punishment for Jehoiakim's disobedience of the Lord's word through the prophet Jeremiah, that the Lord sent the Babylonian troops along with the troops of other loyal nations to inflict military defeats upon Judah. And Judah should have submitted to God. And when we don't submit to God, there's going to be consequences to it. And we also see one of Manasseh's greatest sins is that he persecuted the godly in his day, filling Jerusalem with innocent blood. And in verse 5 through 7 says, now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Jehoiakim rested with his fathers. Then Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place. And the king of Egypt did not come out of the land any more. For the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt, from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. So, when we combine this up, as mentioned before, the book of 2nd Chronicles goes quite well with 2nd Kings and the Chronicles. Chapter 36, verse 6 of 2nd Chronicles tells us that Nebuchadnezzar wanted to take Jehoiakim to Babylon bound in bronze fetters. And Jeremiah 22:9 says that he would disgracefully be buried outside of Jerusalem. And Bible scholar named Donald Wiseman, you probably never heard of him before, but he stated that Jehoiakim's death occurred around December of 598, before Jerusalem's first capture by King Nebuchadnezzar. And verse 8 and 9 says, Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Nathan of Jerusalem, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father had done. So verses 8 and 9, 18 is probably the preferred reading of age rather than the 8 years old that was found in 2nd Chronicles chapter 36 verse 9. And some people, when they hate the Bible, they're going to take scribal errors like that and try to say that the Bible is, the Bible can't be true because, this writer wrote this and this writer wrote this. An age number shouldn't make a huge deal for us. And having regrouped, Nebuchadnezzar, he invaded Judah for the second time in spring of 597 BC. But before he could enter Jerusalem, Jehoiakim died and was succeeded by his son Jehoiachin, who ruled briefly in 597 BC. And Jehoiachin, he carried on the tradition of the wicked kings of Judah. In Jeremiah 22 verse 24, it shows that he was a grievous offender against God. So Jehoiachin was not any better of a leader. Verse 10 through 12, at that time the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city as the servants were besieging it. Then Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his servants, his princes, and his officers went out to the king of Babylon. And the king of Babylon, in the 8th year of his reign, took him prisoner. So the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem had begun by the troops of Nebuchadnezzar. And later we see Nebuchadnezzar himself went to Jerusalem, and it was to the king himself that Jehoiachin surrendered. And the 8th year was 597 BC, and for the first time the books of Kings dated an event in Israelite history by an non-Israelite king. And this indicated in Judah's exile was near, and that the land would be in the hands of the Gentiles. And verse 13 through 16 continues, and he carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, and he cut in pieces all the articles of gold, which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord has said. Also he carried in captivity all Jerusalem, all the captains and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. And he carried Jehoiachin captive to Babylon, the king's mother, the king's wives, his officers, and the mighty of the land he carried into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. All the valiant men, 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths, and 1,000, all who were strong and fit for war. These the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. So we see that King Nebuchadnezzar, he plundered the treasures of the temple and the king's palace, just as the Lord said that would happen back in chapter 20, verse 16 through 18 we saw last week. And in 597 BC, we see Nebuchadnezzar took another 10,000 Judeans as captives to Babylon. Verse 17 continues, then the king of Babylon made Mataniah, however you say this name, this is a fun name, Mataniah, I'm going to go with, Jehoiachin's uncle, king of his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah, which I like the name of Zedekiah. So Mattaniah, he was the son of Josiah, the uncle of Jehoiachin, according to 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 15, which, Lord willing, we're going to see next week. And Mattaniah, it means gift of the Lord, and it's changed to Zedekiah, probably because Mattaniah, they knew I wasn't going to be able to say that name that great. But Zedekiah means the righteousness of the Lord. And Nebuchadnezzar, he demonstrated his authority as Lord, or as ruler over him. In verse 18 through 20, to wrap up the chapter here, says, Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamuto, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. He also did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For because of the anger of the Lord, this happened in Jerusalem and Judah, that he finally cast them out of his presence. Then Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So we see that Zedekiah, he ruled in Jerusalem under the Babylonian sovereignty between 597 to 586 BC. And in 588 BC, Arprias, also known as Hopriah, was the grandson of the Pharaoh, and he became Pharaoh over Egypt. And he appears to have influenced Zedekiah to revolt against Babylon. And when you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 36, along with this chapter, it continues to tell more about the evil reign of Zedekiah. And he rejected God's prophets. He did not want anything to do with them. And you're going to see that Zedekiah was a mocker, and he disregarded the message that the prophets were bringing. But to do a quick wrap up here, to keep it to the point, we look today at the reign of the king of Judah, Jehoiakim, and how King Nebuchadnezzar had made Judah a vassal kingdom. And we see how Jehoiakim had a troubled reign, and we looked at his death. And we looked also at the reign of another evil king that was over Judah named Jehoiachin. And we saw how he surrendered to the king of Babylon. And we see that Jerusalem is impoverished and it's taken captive. And under that captivity was the prophet Ezekiel was around, who compiled the book of his prophecies while in captivity in Babylon. And we look at the appointment of King Zedekiah by King Nebuchadnezzar, who also had an evil reign with his rebellion against God and God's prophets. And that's going to wrap up today's video, as we'll be wrapping up our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Kings, looking tomorrow at the fall of Jerusalem and the captivity of Judah. So I hope you have a great weekend up ahead. I hope that you join us for our last study of 2 Kings, and God bless.